There's a single conversation that destroyed 5 mafia families, ended 40 years of organized crime dominance, and sent over 100 mobsters to prison for life. It happened on December 16, 1985, in a small FBI office in Lower Manhattan. A man named Sammy the Bull Gravano walked in and said 5 words that would change everything. "I want to make a deal." Within 18 months, the entire Gambino crime family was in prison. Within 3 years, the bosses of all 5 New York families were convicted. Within 5 years, the American mafia went from controlling billions in construction, garbage, and union contracts to being a shell of itself, unable to operate openly ever again. One man did this, not with violence, with testimony. But here's what makes this betrayal so devastating. Sammy Gravano wasn't some low-level associate who turned to save himself. He was the underboss of the Gambino family, second in command to John Gotti, the most powerful mobster in America. He had personally killed 19 people. He made millions from construction rackets. He was a made man for 17 years, who took an oath to never cooperate with authorities. Then he broke that oath and destroyed everything. This is how Sammy Gravano went from being John Gotti's most trusted enforcer to the most damaging snitch in mafia history, why his testimony was so catastrophically effective, and how one man's decision to cooperate caused a billion-dollar criminal empire to collapse in less than a decade. Before we understand the destruction, you need to understand what the mob actually controlled in 1985. This wasn't small-time crime. This was systematic control of New York's construction, garbage collection, garment district, waterfront, and dozens of labor unions. The 5 families generated an estimated $50 billion per year in revenue through legitimate and illegitimate operations. The Gambino family alone controlled every major construction project in Manhattan through the concrete club cartel, every garbage truck in New York through private carting monopolies, the Teamsters Union locals at JFK Airport controlling all cargo, the Longshoremen's Union controlling all shipping at the ports, pieces of Las Vegas casinos, loan sharking operations across the city, protection rackets in restaurants and businesses. This wasn't the Godfather movie fantasy. This was real systematic control that extracted money from every corner of New York's economy. Sammy Gravano was essential to this system. He ran a construction company called Marathon that was used to rig bids on city contracts. He collected tribute from union officials who needed mob approval to operate. He organized the murders of people who threatened the business. He sat in meetings with bosses from all 5 families to divide territory and settle disputes. He wasn't a soldier. He was senior management in a multi-billion-dollar criminal corporation. But here's what nobody understood about Sammy. He was a businessman first and a gangster second. He made more money from construction than from traditional mob rackets. He saw the mafia as a business structure that allowed him to make money, not a sacred brotherhood. When John Gotti endangered that business with his ego and recklessness, Sammy made a business decision. He cooperated. John Gotti became boss of the Gambino family on December 16, 1985, by orchestrating the murder of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Sammy Gravano helped plan and execute the hit. 4 shooters in trench coats walked up to Castellano as he got out of his car and shot him 6 times in the head. Gotti and Gravano watched from a car down the street. Within weeks, Gotti was boss and Sammy was underboss. Gotti's reign was flashy and stupid. He wore expensive suits, held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, and gave interviews to newspapers calling himself the Dapper Don. He beat 3 federal prosecutions between 1986 and 1990, earning the nickname the Teflon Don because charges never stuck. He thought he was untouchable. He was actually signing his own death warrant. Here's what Gotti didn't understand. Every time he beat a case, federal prosecutors became more obsessed with taking him down. Every time he gave an interview, he drew more attention to the mob. Every time he appeared in expensive suits at high-profile locations, he made it politically essential for the government to convict him. Gotti's ego demanded public recognition. That recognition made him the FBI's #1 target. But here's what made it personal for Sammy. Gotti held meetings at the Ravenite Social Club above an apartment they used as an office. The FBI had bugged the apartment. In November 1990, they arrested both Gotti and Gravano based on conversations recorded in that apartment. During those tapes, Gotti badmouthed Sammy repeatedly, called him greedy, blamed him for problems, questioned his loyalty. Sammy heard himself being disrespected by a boss who he had helped make through murder. The tapes created a tactical problem. Gotti's lawyers would argue that anything bad on the tapes was actually Sammy's fault, not Gotti's. They would use Sammy as a scapegoat to save Gotti. Sammy would go to prison for life while Gotti might walk. This wasn't acceptable. Sammy had risked everything helping Gotti become boss. Now Gotti was preparing to sacrifice him. December 1991. Sammy Gravano sat in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. He was facing life in prison. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The FBI had tapes of him discussing murders, extortion, and racketeering. His lawyer told him there was no defense. He was going to die in prison. But the FBI made an offer. Cooperate, testify against John Gotti, and they would recommend a reduced sentence. For any other made member of the Mafia, this would be unthinkable. The oath of omerta, the code of silence, was absolute. Snitches were killed along with their families. Cooperating was worse than death because it meant dying with dishonor. Sammy spent 3 weeks considering it. He called his wife from jail and spoke in code. He talked to his lawyer about the consequences. He thought about dying in prison for a boss who disrespected him. And he thought about the fundamental reality of his situation. John Gotti had gotten him arrested through recklessness. John Gotti's lawyers were preparing to blame him. John Gotti had broken the rules first. On December 16, 1991, exactly 6 years after helping Gotti murder Castellano to become boss, Sammy Gravano told his lawyer to make the deal. He would cooperate fully. He would testify against Gotti. He would tell the FBI everything he knew about 19 murders, decades of racketeering, and the inner workings of the Gambino family. The FBI couldn't believe their luck. The underboss of the Gambino family was cooperating, not some low-level associate, the #2 man in the most powerful crime family in America, someone who had been in meetings with bosses from all 5 families, someone who knew where the bodies were buried because he had buried them personally. The FBI had been trying to break the Mafia for 40 years. Sammy Gravano just handed them everything. The debriefing started immediately. FBI agents sat with Sammy for hundreds of hours over 4 months. They asked about murders, rackets, meetings, and the entire structure of the Gambino family. Sammy answered every question. He had a photographic memory for details and a businessman's understanding of operations. He didn't just tell them who killed who. He explained how the system worked. He gave them the Castellano murder, who ordered it, who planned it, who the shooters were, where the guns came from, where Gotti and Sammy watched from. Complete reconstruction of the most high-profile mob hit in 30 years. Without Sammy's testimony, Gotti could never be convicted of ordering Castellano's murder because there were no other witnesses who would talk. He gave them 19 murders he participated in. Names, dates, methods, locations, reasons. Some were mob hits ordered by bosses. Others were business disputes that got violent. He described how murders were approved in meetings, carried out by teams of soldiers, and covered up afterward. Each murder became a potential RICO charge that prosecutors could stack on defendants. He explained the Concrete Club. This was the cartel that controlled all major construction in New York. Mob families divided the market. Any concrete job over $2 million had to be approved by the mob. Contractors paid 2% of the contract value to the families. Sammy's company Marathon was a key part of enforcing this system. The FBI knew the Concrete Club existed, but never had testimony from someone inside explaining how it operated. He detailed the union control system, how the Gambino family controlled Teamsters locals at JFK Airport, how they extorted union officials who needed mob permission to work, how they used union connections to rig bids, control hiring, and extract money from every major project. Union corruption was a key source of mob power, and Sammy explained the entire mechanism. He identified corrupt officials, cops who fed information to the mob, judges who took bribes, union leaders who kicked back money, defense lawyers who were mob associates, building inspectors who looked the other way, the system of corruption that allowed the mob to operate with impunity. Sammy gave names, dates, and specific examples. But here's what made his testimony uniquely devastating. Sammy wasn't lying to reduce his sentence. He was telling the absolute truth because he had nothing to gain from lying. If he lied and was caught, his cooperation agreement was void and he went to prison for life. So he told the truth about everything, including his own crimes. This made him incredibly credible. He admitted to 19 murders. He wasn't trying to minimize his role. He was explaining exactly how the system worked. The trial of John Gotti began on February 12, 1992. The prosecution's strategy was simple. They would use FBI surveillance tapes to prove Gotti was the boss of the Gambino family. Then they would use Sammy Gravano to prove Gotti ordered specific crimes, including the murder of Paul Castellano. The tapes plus Sammy's testimony would be insurmountable. Gotti's lawyers tried to destroy Sammy's credibility. They painted him as a serial killer who was lying to save himself. They pointed out he admitted to 19 murders. They questioned how anyone could believe a mass murderer. They suggested he was framing Gotti to reduce his own sentence. But the prosecution had anticipated this. They played the surveillance tapes where Gotti badmouthed Sammy. They showed the jury that Gotti was preparing to blame Sammy for everything. They demonstrated that Sammy was cooperating because Gotti had betrayed him first, not because he was lying. The defense strategy backfired because it made Sammy's motivation for cooperating completely believable. Sammy testified for 9 days. He described the Castellano murder in minute detail. Who was where, what weapons were used, what Gotti said before and after. He explained how Gotti became boss through murder. He detailed the structure of the Gambino family and Gotti's role running it. He admitted to his own murders without minimizing his involvement. The jury found it completely credible. Here was a man who admitted to being a serial killer, who didn't try to make himself look good, who provided details that matched physical evidence and surveillance tapes. He wasn't spinning a story to save himself. He was telling the truth about his criminal career and Gotti's role in it. On April 2nd, 1992, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Gotti guilty on all 14 counts: murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, everything. The Teflon Don's luck had finally run out. The most powerful mobster in America was going to die in prison, and Sammy Gravano had put him there. The judge sentenced Gotti to life in prison without possibility of parole. Gotti never spoke to Sammy again. He died in prison in 2002, still maintaining he had done nothing wrong. Sammy Gravano, the man who helped make him boss, had destroyed him completely. But here's where the story gets truly catastrophic for the mob. Sammy didn't just testify against Gotti. Over the next 3 years, he testified in more than a dozen trials against members of all 5 New York families. Every major case where prosecutors needed testimony about mob operations, Sammy was the witness. He became the government's weapon against organized crime. The Gambino family was decimated first. After Gotti was convicted, prosecutors went after every high-ranking member. Sammy testified against Gotti's brother Peter, against capos who ran crews, against soldiers who carried out hits. By 1995, over 40 Gambino members were in prison for life based partly on Sammy's testimony. The family went from 300 made members to barely 100 capable of operating. But the damage spread to other families. Sammy had been in meetings with bosses from the Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. He testified about the commission meetings where bosses divided territory and approved murders. He explained how the families cooperated on the Concrete Club and other rackets. His testimony helped convict leadership across all 5 families. Vincent, the Chin Gigante, boss of the Genovese family, was convicted in 1997. Sammy's testimony helped establish the existence of the commission and Gigante's role on it. Gigante had avoided prosecution for decades by pretending to be mentally ill, walking around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe talking to himself. Sammy's testimony proved he was actually the most powerful boss in New York. Gigante got life in prison. Vittorio Vicamuso, boss of the Lucchese family, was convicted in 1992, largely on Sammy's testimony. Amuso had ordered the murders of dozens of people in the late 1980s in a paranoid purge of his own family. Sammy provided testimony about meetings where Amuso discussed these murders. Amuso got life plus 455 years. Carmine Persico, boss of the Colombo family, was already in prison but faced additional charges. Sammy's testimony added decades to his sentence. Persico died in prison in 2019, having spent 33 years locked up, partly because of what Sammy told prosecutors about commission meetings and inter-family rackets. Even the Bonanno family, which Sammy had less direct contact with, was damaged. His testimony about the commission and mob protocol was used in multiple Bonanno cases. The family had already been weakened by an FBI undercover operation in the 1980s. Sammy's cooperation finished them off as a major power. By 1995, all 5 bosses of the New York families were either dead or in prison for life. The FBI estimated that over 100 made members across all 5 families were convicted based partly on Sammy's testimony. The multi-billion-dollar enterprise that controlled New York's underworld for 50 years was broken, not through police work alone, through one man deciding to cooperate. But here's what made Sammy's cooperation uniquely destructive beyond just the convictions. He broke the psychological foundation of mafia power. The oath of omerta was absolute because everyone believed it was absolute. You don't cooperate because you'll be killed, and everyone believes you don't cooperate. This belief system kept hundreds of mobsters silent for decades, even when facing life in prison. Sammy shattered that belief. If the underboss of the Gambino family, a man who killed 19 people, a made member for 17 years, could cooperate and survive, then anyone could cooperate. The mob's power was based on fear and loyalty. Sammy proved that fear could be overcome and loyalty was conditional. The floodgates opened after Sammy. Between 1992 and 2000, over 1,000 mob members and associates became cooperating witnesses. Some were facing serious charges. Others just saw which way the wind was blowing. The FBI played Sammy's example repeatedly. Even the underboss cooperated. You're not tougher than Sammy the Bull. Make a deal. Michael, the Yuppie Don. Franzese, a Colombo capo who made $300 million from a gasoline tax scam, cooperated in 1991, partly because he saw Sammy's decision as validating his own. If Sammy could cooperate, then Michael could too without being the first. The psychological barrier was broken. Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, underboss of the Philadelphia mob, cooperated in 1989 before Sammy, but Sammy's cooperation validated his decision retroactively. Leonetti testified against his own uncle, Philadelphia boss Nicky Scarfo. Sammy's later cooperation proved that even higher-ranking members would break omerta. Alphonse Little Al Darko, acting boss of the Lucchese family, became a cooperating witness in 1991. He was the highest-ranking member to flip before Sammy. But Sammy's cooperation was more damaging because he was more notorious and his testimony was more comprehensive. Frankie Fapiano, a Genovese soldier, cooperated after Sammy and cited Sammy's example. He told investigators, "If Sammy could do it, I could do it." That statement appeared in dozens of debriefings. Sammy's cooperation gave permission to others to break the code. But here's the mechanism of destruction. Once cooperation became common, trust within families evaporated. Bosses couldn't trust anyone. Soldiers suspected each other. Meetings became dangerous because anyone could be recording. The mob's entire operational structure relied on trust and shared code. When that code broke, the structure collapsed. By 2000, the FBI estimated that 30 to 40% of mob members facing serious charges were considering cooperation. Before Sammy, That number was under 5%. The cultural shift from never cooperate to cooperate if the deal is good enough destroyed the mob's ability to function. You can't run a criminal enterprise when 1/3 of your members might flip. The convictions and cooperation wave destroyed the mob's economic power. Let's quantify what actually collapsed between 1992 and 2002. The concrete club was broken by 1995. Federal prosecutors used Sammy's testimony to convict contractors and mob members who ran the cartel. The system of taxing every major construction project ended. The FBI estimated this cartel generated $100 million per year for the families. Gone. Private carting monopolies were broken by 1996. The mob controlled garbage collection in New York through a system of divided territories. Federal prosecutions destroyed this monopoly. The Gambino family alone made an estimated $30 million per year from garbage collection. Multiple families participated. Total annual revenue was probably $100 million plus. Gone. Union control weakened dramatically. Federal oversight of corrupt Teamsters locals eliminated mob influence at JFK and in construction unions. The longshoremen's union at the ports was put under government supervision. The garment district unions were cleaned up. The mob made hundreds of millions per year from union control, extortion, and using unions to rig bids. This income stream was severely damaged. Las Vegas casino interests were eliminated. The mob families had hidden ownership stakes in several Las Vegas casinos through frontmen. Federal investigations in the 1980s and 1990s forced these interests to be sold. The Gambino family alone had pieces of casinos worth tens of millions. Multiple families participated. This income disappeared. Loan sharking and bookmaking continued, but at much smaller scale. These traditional mob activities required muscle to collect debts. With so many members in prison and others cooperating, the mob couldn't operate openly. Revenue from these activities dropped by an estimated 60 to 70%. Added up, the five families went from controlling an estimated $1 to $2 billion per year in revenue in 1990 to maybe $200 to $300 million by 2000. That's an 85 to 90% collapse in one decade. Not because the economy crashed, because the FBI used cooperating witnesses like Sammy Gravano to destroy the systems that generated this revenue. But here's the most important economic impact. The mob lost the ability to operate openly in legitimate business. Before Sammy, mob members owned construction companies, carting companies, and businesses that made money legally while providing cover for illegal activities. After Sammy, anyone identified as mob-connected was barred from government contracts, denied business licenses, and put under investigation. The ability to hide in legitimate business disappeared. Sammy's own company, Marathon Construction, was taken apart by federal prosecutors. They identified every contract Marathon received through mob influence. They forced the company to pay back millions in profits. They banned Sammy's associates from the construction industry. The model Sammy used to make millions legally while being a mobster became impossible. By 2005, the American Mafia was a shadow of its former self, still dangerous, still involved in crime, but unable to control entire industries, unable to operate openly, unable to generate billions in revenue. One man's testimony had started a chain reaction that destroyed 50 years of organized crime infrastructure in 10 years. Let's understand why Sammy Gravano's cooperation was so much more damaging than other witnesses. The FBI had cooperating witnesses before Sammy. They had mobsters who testified against their bosses. Why was Sammy different? First, his rank. He was underboss of the Gambino family. That meant he was in the room when decisions were made. He attended commission meetings with bosses from all five families. He knew the structure of every major racket. Lower-level cooperators could only testify about their own crew's activities. Sammy could testify about the entire organization. Second, his credibility. He admitted to 19 murders. He didn't minimize his role or claim he was forced to commit crimes. He took full responsibility for being a serial killer and a career criminal. This brutal honesty made juries believe everything else he said. If he was willing to admit to being a monster, He had no reason to lie about Gotti or anyone else. Third, his memory. Sammy had a photographic memory for details. He could recall conversations from years earlier, describe exact locations where meetings occurred, name everyone present at specific events. Defense lawyers tried to trip him up on cross-examination and couldn't. His testimony was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by physical evidence. Fourth, his business understanding. Sammy wasn't just a killer. He ran legitimate construction companies and understood how the mob's business operations worked. He could explain to juries how construction bid rigging functioned, how union extortion worked, how money moved through the system. He testified like a business executive explaining corporate structure, not like a thug describing crimes. Fifth, his willingness to testify repeatedly. Some cooperators testify once and disappear into witness protection. Sammy testified in over a dozen trials across 3 years. Every major mob case needed his testimony. Prosecutors could build cases around his willingness to testify rather than hoping he would cooperate when needed. But here's the most important factor: timing. Sammy cooperated at exactly the moment when the FBI had new tools to destroy the mob. The RICO statute passed in 1970 allowed prosecutors to charge entire organizations rather than individual crimes. But RICO cases required cooperating witnesses to explain how the organization worked. Sammy provided that testimony at scale. Electronic surveillance gave prosecutors tapes of mob members talking, but tapes alone couldn't convict because mobsters spoke in code and never explicitly stated crimes. Sammy could testify about what the coded language meant. The combination of tapes plus Sammy's explanation was devastating. The FBI had spent 40 years infiltrating the mob. Undercover agents, wiretaps, surveillance. They had mountains of evidence, but no one to explain it in court. Sammy was the Rosetta Stone that made all that evidence usable. Without him, much of what the FBI knew couldn't be proven. With him, it became the basis for hundreds of convictions. After testifying in more than a dozen trials and sending over 100 mobsters to prison, Sammy Gravano received his sentence in 1994. He pled guilty to 19 murders and racketeering. The sentencing guidelines said life in prison. The prosecution recommended 5 years based on his cooperation. The judge gave him 5 years for 19 murders and decades of organized crime. 5 years. He was released in 1995 after serving 4 years and 8 months total, including time before trial. The most damaging witness in mob history walked out of prison before he turned 50 years old. But here's the cost of his cooperation. He had a death sentence on his head from multiple mob families. The FBI put him in witness protection with a new identity. He moved to Arizona under the name Jimmy Moran. He was forbidden from contacting anyone from his old life. His wife divorced him. His children struggled with what he had done. The psychological cost was enormous. Sammy had spent his entire adult life as a mobster. That identity was gone. He had murdered 19 people and helped convict 100 more. The guilt would haunt him. He had betrayed everyone he had ever worked with. The isolation was total. But he was alive and free. For a man facing life in prison for 19 murders, that's an incredible deal. The government calculated that his cooperation was worth the leniency. They got the testimony that destroyed the mob. He got to leave prison before age 50. Both sides won. Here's where Sammy screwed it up. In 2000, 5 years after being released, he was arrested for running an ecstasy distribution ring in Arizona. He couldn't stay away from crime. He violated his cooperation agreement and went back to prison for 20 years. He was released in 2017 after serving 17 years. The final tally. Sammy Gravano spent about 22 years in prison total for 19 murders and decades of organized crime. Without cooperation, he would have died in prison. His testimony bought him freedom, and then he threw it away by returning to crime. But even with the ecstasy conviction, he still came out far ahead of where he would have been without cooperating. The Mafia had a rule that would have prevented the Sammy Gravano disaster. Never let members get too powerful. Never let one person know too much about everyone's operations. Never create a situation where one cooperating witness can destroy the entire organization. They broke this rule with Sammy. As underboss, he was in meetings with all the top people. He knew about rackets across all 5 families. He participated in or knew about dozens of murders. He was present at commission meetings. The mob's decentralized structure that once protected them was centralized enough that Sammy had a view of everything. Here's what should have protected them. The mob had survived for a century by keeping information compartmentalized. Soldiers knew about their crew's activities, but not other crews. Capos knew about their family's operations, but not other families. The structure was designed so that even if someone cooperated, they could only damage a small part of the organization. But the 1980s changed this. The mob was making so much money from construction, garbage, and unions that coordination between families became necessary. The commission became more active. High-ranking members from different families worked together regularly. This coordination made the mob more efficient, but more vulnerable. Sammy was the product of this vulnerability. He worked with members of all 5 families on the Concrete Club. He attended meetings where multiple bosses discussed business. He was exactly the kind of cross-organization player that old-school mob structure was designed to prevent. And when he flipped, he took down everyone he had worked with. The mob tried to adapt after Sammy. Families became more insular. They stopped working together as much. They avoided creating underbosses or counselors who knew everything. But the damage was done. The FBI had learned that high-ranking cooperators were the key to destroying the mob. They pursued this strategy relentlessly. By the late 1990s, the mob's response was paranoia. Members suspected everyone of being informants. Meetings were rare. Communication was minimal. Business suffered because coordination became impossible. The cure for cooperation was isolation, and isolation made the mob unable to operate effectively. The American Mafia never recovered. In 2025, organized crime still exists, but it's fragmented, small-scale, and incapable of controlling entire industries. The 5 families still technically exist, but with a fraction of their former membership and none of their former power. Sammy Gravano's testimony started the decline that became permanent. Sammy the Bull Gravano walked into an FBI office on December 16, 1991, and said he wanted to cooperate. That decision led to John Gotti spending the rest of his life in prison. It led to over 100 mob members being convicted. It led to the collapse of billion-dollar rackets. It led to 1,000 more mobsters cooperating after Sammy showed them it was possible. One man's testimony destroyed what the FBI couldn't destroy in 40 years. Not because Sammy was particularly brave or principled. He cooperated to save himself from dying in prison, and because John Gotti had disrespected him. His motivations were selfish and personal, but the impact was systemic and catastrophic. The mob survived murderous gang wars, FBI investigations, and decades of prosecutions. What it couldn't survive was its own members deciding that the code of silence was less important than self-preservation. Sammy didn't just break Omerta, he proved that Omerta could be broken by anyone for good enough reason. The billion-dollar empire collapsed because one man decided his freedom was more valuable than his honor. The mob's entire system was based on the belief that no one would make that calculation. Sammy proved them wrong, and the empire died in less than a decade. Today, Sammy Gravano is 80 years old, living in Arizona and podcasting about his mob days. He's making money telling stories about the people he helped send to prison and the organization he destroyed. The man who murdered 19 people and betrayed 100 more is now a minor celebrity sharing mob anecdotes on social media. That's the final insult. The snitch who destroyed the mob is profiting from his story, while the people he betrayed are dead or in prison for life. The Code of Omerta said, snitches should die. Sammy's still here, monetizing his betrayal. One conversation, 5 words. December 16th, 1991. I want to make a deal. That's all it took to end the American Mafia's reign as the most powerful criminal organization in the world.